Can you tell me your reaction when Tim reached out originally? Did you think this guy was a kook, who he was? I mean, what'd you think?
Yeah, I retired about a year ago, and life was running smoothly, no drama. And then all of a sudden, I get this, I get this email from a total stranger from Texas stating that he has some information about my family. And of course, the first thing that came to mind was this is probably some kind of a ransom scheme. I was really skeptical.
Did he tell you what it was?
Well, he said he had some information. He kept it fairly broad, not too specific at the time. But he eventually made a compelling case that he did indeed have some legitimate information about the Sebba family. And he produced, some documents, some photos, my grandmother's passport, and of course these letters that we're about to talk about. So, he hooked me in with those, and from that point on, we kind of put it all together and had some great discussions, and I eventually went out to Dallas to meet him. And
yeah, I saw some of the pictures when you came out here, and he mentioned you were coming out again soon, I think the next couple of weeks. What was your reaction? You didn't know anything about these letters, I guess, right, Frank?
I knew nothing about them. My grandmother never talked about any of this. My mother never talked anything about this. My grandmother survived my mother. My mother died at a fairly early age, so I didn't have an opportunity to ask about that side of the family. I knew plenty about my paternal grandparents' family, called the Pringhams. Evidently, they were quite famous in Germany, but nothing about the Sebba family, other than my grandmother had a brother, and my grandmother lost a daughter early in her daughter's life, and that was it. That was it.
Yeah, I mean, you would have known to ask about your great uncle, I guess. You would have known to ask about him, but she never really talked about him or the war or leaving.
Until her very last years, before she passed away in her 90s, she reverted back to her German language, and every once in a while I heard Bruder, which meant brother. And so at that point, I knew that she had a brother, but I never knew this from my mother. Or my grandmother at the time. So when Tim discovered all this stuff, a whole new world opened up to me. It was incredible.
Give me an idea when he detailed some of the letters, what they included. I mean, it's the brutality that these letters document it's gut wrenching.
Yeah,
but this is your family. I mean.
Right. This opened up a whole new world for me personally. This was a story that came out of the 30s and the 1940s, and nobody really talked, which was typical of this generation that survived the war years, that their way of dealing with it was not to talk about it. And Tim and I are finding this out, almost on a weekly basis. People just don't want to talk. This is their therapy in a sense. That not talking about it is their way of getting through it. So a lot of people never knew about this stuff, and thanks to you folks and others, we're getting this story out at this current time. And again, this happened years ago. But yeah, this was pretty. I think in a word, heart wrenching would be the term I'd use for the letters. They were something else, and yeah, I had no idea that my family went through this stuff.
What was your grandmother like? What do you remember about her?
Very positive. I mean, despite all of the history that was in the letters and the documents that we found after we read the letters, I always remember she always had a glint in her eye. As long as I knew her, when she came over from England, after we came over from England and settled with us in Detroit. That's the one thing I remember. Very positive. Her husband, Max, same thing. Very giving, very loving. Just a wonderful grandmother.
Why do you think she saved these letters?
That's a question we may not be able to answer. I don't know if she intended anybody to see them, but obviously she was hesitant in throwing them away. She obviously had the memory of the letters. But I'm not sure. That's a great question, and I can't answer it, quite honestly.
Tim mentioned that you guys are possibly going to go over to Germany to see this building where your great uncle and his family lived. What do you expect that to be like, Frank?
Well, it's going to add some more imagery, I think, to the letters. Where this event took place in Neustrelitz in Germany. We're even thinking of maybe going up to Gdansk, where my mother was born, where my grandmother and grandfather grew up. It used to be called the Free State of Danzig. So I don't know what we're going to find. I know Tim and I are convinced that this story still has legs. And so I think that's the main reason we're going over there. Maybe look at the graves, if we can find the graves of the Weiss family. Maybe talk to some people, any archivists that might know something about this terrible event that happened literally a week before the war ended, when the Russians came in from the east. I think what's amazing is that my family survived not only the Nazis on the one side, but the Russian army coming in from the other side, literally. Fortunately, my grandparents survived. The Weiss family did not.
You mentioned that you weren't sure if your grandmother wanted these to be found.
Yeah, I mean, she put them in a hidden compartment. I question whether my mother even knew about this story. She may have, my grandmother may have kept them from her as well, because my mother never talked about this at all. Wow. So I don't know. It's a great question, and I don't know if we'll ever find, well, until maybe we pass on to our second world, we may never know why she kept the letters.
What do you think should happen to them now?
Well, I can tell you what Tim and I don't think should happen to them, and that is to give them to some entity that's just going to catalog them, put them away for safekeeping, and lock them up. I mean, we can do that with a safety deposit box in a bank, of course. What we really want to do is get this out to somebody or some, again, entity that can really educate the public on what happened back then. We're looking around. We want to expose as much as what we're doing right now. Exposing the story and telling people what happened back in the 30s and the 40s, and hopefully learn something from what happened. Although I'm convinced this stuff is still happening around the world as we speak.
That's a good
but
point.
I think it's a good history. It's a good history lesson, and we're not the only story about this kind of. Well, you can call it a Holocaust outside of the concentration camps. It was more or less a Holocaust. Yeah, there's plenty of stories like ours that may not have been exposed yet. Again, because that generation never talked about this stuff. So if you permit me, I have some advice to anybody that really wants to, get into the heritage, the background, the genealogy of your family. Yeah, you can get on the internet as Tim and I did, but if you can get a hold of a family member or a friend of the family that can talk about, your family generation or two back, I strongly advise people to do that. I mean, there's an emotional feedback that you just can't get from social media and the internet, So if you can sit down with somebody, get the information now. What you do with that obviously is up to you. But, let's face it, most of us are privy to the Tim Mallads of the world to expose and discover this stuff for us. So I was the fortunate one.
How has this revelation changed you at all, or has it?
Oh yeah, it definitely has. Again, I knew a lot about my paternal grandparents and family, but knowing what happened now, and there may be more information to come about the Sebba family, is it struck me. I mean, when Tim first read these letters to me, there was a tear in my eye, and concurrently my daughters and Tim's daughters, and Tim and I talked this morning, when they read or heard about these letters, they were overcome, as was I. So it was quite again heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching. It got to me. And it's still, every time I read them or hear them, no dry eyes in this house. I'll
Yeah,
tell you that.
I bet. And I wanted to ask you a last question too, Frank. What do you think is the legacy of these letters? Why is it so important to hang on to these, to keep these around, even though they're 73, 74 years old?
Well, that originally might have been a question for my grandmother, because as we found out, she held on to these letters for a reason. We don't know what that is, but I think Tim and I both agree that we have to expose this incident. And there's more stories within this. There was, Tim getting hold of the desk, Tim finding me, and discovering and having the letters translated, which I think was the culmination of all of this. And I think we really want to get this story out there again, so we can learn something about it. And it's history. For me, it's personal. For Tim, it's become personal. I kiddingly call Tim my brother from another grandmother. But he's been passionate about this, maybe more so than even me. But he's become family. But to answer your question, I think we just need to get this out. It's a compelling story. It's a heart-wrenching story, but it's a story about survival, not obviously for the Weiss family, but for my grandparents who fled Germany just in time, along with my mother, just in time, before the Russians came in and before the real fall of Germany. And fortunately, they survived in England, and then we came over to the Promised Land here in the United States through Ellis Island.
Wow.
Back in the 50s. And I think it gives me, how would I put it? It makes me appreciate this country even more, I think, knowing about what could have happened to my family. We could have all been wiped out, and I wouldn't be here talking to you today.